Welcome back to Media Apocalypse, our series about the threats facing journalism, news gathering, and the flow of information on matters of public concern in our democracy, and dedicated to exploring solutions, both legal and otherwise, for preserving the press function. Today's conversation is with James T. Hamilton, who is the Hearst Professor of Communication and the Director of the Journalism Program at Stanford University. He's one of the nation's top media economists, and his books on media markets and information provision include Democracy's Detectives, The Economics of Investigative Journalism, and All the News That's Fit to Sell, How the Market Transforms Information into News. He's also just co-authored an article with Fiona Morgan called Poor Information, How Economics Affects the Information Lives of Low-Income Individuals. And he's working on some interesting projects in the field of computational journalism that explore how the costs of story discovery can be lowered. Thank you so much for joining us, Jay. We're really thrilled to have a chance to talk to you.
It's great to be here. Thank you.
We'll kick off with a couple of questions from me, and then I will hand things off to Sandy and to Scott to think about some of the questions that they have. I'm hoping that you can start us off with just the sort of bare bones background of the space in which you research and how it maps on to the incredibly quickly changing media landscape and political landscape of this moment. I'm especially interested in sort of the framework of how the market turns information into news, right? Both on the supply side and on the demand side. And you've talked a lot about how there are some topics, particularly political topics and democracy enhancement topics, on which people remain quite rationally uninformed. So there's this big gap between what people maybe need to know as citizens and what they want to know as news consumers. And I'm hoping you can just sort of describe for us that framework and sort of how you thought about it and what it looks like conceptually, and also how it might have changed in this in the last couple of years in the vastly changed media environment and political landscape.
So everybody on this call has 4 information demands in our lives as consumers. We're looking for products and prices. In our lives as workers, information that helps us do our day job. In our lives as audience members, that could be Netflix or Hulu. And in our lives as voters. And Anthony Downs wrote a great book out of a Stanford Econ PhD thesis in 1957 called An Economic Theory of Democracy. And what he said was the first 3 demands work pretty well because if you don't seek out the information, you don't get the benefit. So if you don't know what's good on Netflix, you miss out on some opportunities. But think about that 4th demand, the voter information demand. Even if you really care about candidate A versus candidate B winning, and even if more information about those 2 candidates would help you make a better decision from the perspectives of your fundamental preferences, the probability that your vote matters in a statistical sense is close to 0. So what that means is that the costs of becoming informed about politics outweigh the benefits, and that explains why most people remain rationally ignorant about the details of policy most of the time. Now that's approaching public affairs as an investment decision. I direct the journalism program at Stanford. I help train the next generation of public affairs reporters. So how do I explain their existence? I call it the 3 Ds, duty, diversion, and drama. Some people feel they have a duty to become informed or vote. That's a consumption of an ideology or a worldview. You don't show up to vote because you think your vote is going to determine who the president is. You do it because it expresses your worldview, or it's almost like clapping because you're a fan of a party. Diversion, for some people, C-SPAN is as interesting as ESPN. Don't try to build a business around that. That's probably a 1 rating on a good day. And drama. Maybe I can't tell you the details of politics, but I can tell you about politics as a horse race. Who's ahead, who's behind, who's in a scandal. So on the demand side, when you think about why public affairs reporting is underprovided, it's really this notion of rational ignorance. there are particular set of stories, investigative reporting, that also face the challenge that accountability is a public good. We'd all like to live in a world where people read about the local school board and hold people accountable, but while we let other people read, we'll watch Netflix. So there's this free rider problem. On the supply side, there are really 5 reasons why people provide you with information. One is pay me. That's the subscription model. One is I want to sell your attention to someone. That's advertising. One is I want your vote. That's partisan. One is I want to change how you think about the world. That's nonprofit. And one is I just like to talk. That's self-expression. That's social media. That's Facebook, Twitter. And what we're seeing with the internet for news is a shift away from advertising to subscription and nonprofit as the incentives that lead toward the creation of hard news or public affairs. So when I step back and look at what's going on today, people will often talk about news quality or news bias in terms of conspiracies. For me, it's simply a matter of supply and demand, an under-provision because of problems of free riding and public goods, and a shift in incentives towards subscription or nonprofit, or in the case of social media, self-expression. And that also creates problems for the market for truth, which we'll probably get into later.
That's super helpful. I want to follow up a little bit on the question of investigative reporting in particular, and the sort of ways you've thought about that within the media economics and incentives framework. It seems to me, and we've talked about this a lot with other guests in other conversations, that investigative reporting is one of the things that we sort of really count on if we're thinking about that core democratic press function, that sort of watchdog checking function of the press. And but it also seems like investigative reporting, if we're really just tallying up costs, like raw costs of what to do, has a lot of them. It's costly to engage in the behavior. It's costly to overcome the hurdles of government pushback against the behavior. It's costly, if we think about it from the law vantage point, to litigate the kinds of things, FOIA requests and access to various documents. And I'm wondering if you have thought about the sort of cost-benefit ratio in particular in the investigative reporting space in terms of what the payoffs are, right? Are we right in our instincts that investigative reporting pays big dividends to us individually in terms of net policy benefits? And if so, do you have concrete ideas about how we can properly incentivize the continuation of investigative reporting in the changing media landscape?
Sure. So in 2011, I was working for Steve Waldman when he was running a group at the FCC, a study group on the information needs of communities. And I was struck by some people in DC who felt like there was no market failure in news or investigative reporting. They basically believe the public interest is defined by the public's interest. And that harkens back to a 1980s deregulatory FCC, where the FCC chairman said TV is just a toaster with pictures, there's nothing special about it. Or in the early 2000s, Michael Powell, when first day he was the chair of FCC, asked about the digital divide, said, I think there's a Mercedes divide. I'd like to have one, but I can't afford it. I think that there's definitely a market failure relating to investigative reporting. And the idea is that when you tell a story that changes lives and laws, it spills over on people who aren't your readers or subscribers, and you can't fully monetize that benefit. I decided to try to write a book called eventually Democracy's Detectives that would actually do case studies using almost OMB-like guidelines to say, what is the impact of an investigation? So at the time I was teaching at Duke University, and I read a story that had a big impact on me in the Raleigh News and Observer, McClatchy paper. The student body president of UNC was murdered, a Duke graduate student was murdered, and it turns out it was by people who were improperly out on a malfunctioning probation system. And the News and Observer said, how frequently is it the case that somebody who's out on probation and parole kills somebody in North Carolina? So they took 6 months to answer that question. And it turns out between 2000 and 2008, 580 people were murdered by somebody out on probation or parole in North Carolina. That fact cost more than $200,000 to create. I talked to the managing editor of the paper. We costed it out. And it's costly because if you think about it, nobody had the incentive to calculate that. The courts didn't have it, the prison systems, the probation system didn't. So it took 6 months of multiple people to figure that out. Once that fact was published in a 3-part series, it led to changes. People were fired, $10 million was put into the system to improve the functioning of probation. And what I did was I went back and said, okay, now that policy has changed, can you estimate how the world changed? And what I found was that making a set of assumptions that the first year that the new policies were in place, 8 fewer people were killed by somebody out on probation or parole. Now, assume that you took that as an accurate statistical estimate. You're then saying, how do I put a value on 8 statistical lives? OMB tells us, based on consumer data and worker data, they use a value of statistical life of about $9.2 million per life. So you multiply 8 lives saved times 9.2 million per statistical life for the first year of the policy being implemented, subtract out the cost of prison, the additional costs of probation and parole. And you find that for each dollar the News and Observer spent on that investigation, society got several hundred dollars in net policy benefits. Now, if you're living in the Raleigh-Durham area, you don't roll out of bed in the morning and say, thank you, News and Observer, for lowering the probability that I will be killed by today. But that benefit exists and it's hard to monetize. And that difficulty of generating positive change in society and yet not being rewarded fully for that investment is why we would provide investigative reporting. Investigative reporting does have benefits. It creates a brand. The chief information officer of the Washington Post has said that when they study what stories people are reading when they hit the paywall and then jump over and pay, it's opinion and politics and investigative reporting. It's part of product differentiation. So there's a market demand for it. There's also morale demand for your workers. It also means something to owners too. But in general, it's underprovided because it provides positive externalities or spillovers of public goods.
Right, and do you think that the scope or breadth or nature of those positive externalities are shifting as the media and political landscape shifts, or are they similar to what they were a decade ago?
Well, unfortunately, institutions are a set of principal agent delegations, right? That voters delegates to Congress, Congress delegates to agencies, agencies may delegate to companies in terms of regulatory compliance. There are many different reasons why institutions break down. And they break down because of hidden action and hidden information. When we delegate a decision, we don't see what people are doing and we don't know the information set they have. So that's inherent in the way private and public institutions operate. And investigative reporting is really original work about issues of substantive interest to the community that somebody is trying to keep secret. And because we have this delegation of authority, but difficulty in following up, the potential benefits of accountability are very large. And so those problems are definitely remain.
Yeah, I want to hand off to Sandy, but I have one quick question that I want to ask you before I do, which is just like, let's imagine that we gave you the, we gave you the magic wand, right? You get to tap the American media and political system and bring about a change, one piece of structural reform, and you don't face the political barriers or the practical barriers of doing so. You just get to fix something that you're confident will help tilt the incentives in the right direction for democracy. What move do you make?
What I'd like is for the government to recognize the market failures in journalism and therefore be willing to treat that market failure the same way it treats environmental protection or education or national defense. So in 2008, I submitted an NSF grant on computational journalism. I knew it wouldn't get funded, but I wanted to see how people would react to the topic. And one set of people said, public interest data mining is too hard. You'll never be able to help reporters use algorithms to spot anomalies and write stories. And the other set of reviewers said, these challenges are trivial. We've solved them in the war on terror. We have great algorithms to monitor people. And the irony is, I know Palantir exists. I know that the government and the net, because it recognizes national defense as a public good, funds a lot of R&D to help solve algorithmic problems. But I'm talking about this question of who will watch the watchers, right? How can we scrutinize government? So there are a whole slew of things that would follow if the government embraced that as a problem. It would invest in R&D on computational journalism, for instance. It would make it easier for nonprofits who view provision of news as their reason for existence, make it easier for them to prosper. So there are a whole set of things that flow from recognizing that market failure. So that's sort of a geeky answer, but I think that would be something that I would hope might happen.
Geeky answers are our favorite flavor of answer around here. So thank you so much. I'm going to hand things off to Sandy.
Thank you, and thank you, Jay, for being here. Geeky answers, it seems to me, are answers. And I come out of the media law world and not the scholarly world. So solutions are what I trade in and am most interested in. But to follow up on, RonNell was asking about investigative reporting. As I read your material, I had a hard time understanding if there were any economic incentives in the current environment for producing quality journalism for low-income communities, or even in today's media world and economic environment, small towns, rural areas, as well as minority communities, indigenous communities. Tell me, I'm misreading your material and where I should find those incentives, where you would look for them.
Economists always say relative to what? So if I'm thinking for the low-income communities, I did work with Fiona Morgan on the information lives of low-income individuals, and I'm now working with a graduate student at Stanford, Jihye Lee, on studying the screen life of low-income individuals. If you think about those 5 incentives, low-income individuals are less likely to spend on subscriptions because they are thinking about things like rent and utility, less likely to be the target of most advertisers, although they are targeted online with payday lending and other deceptive advertising. They're less likely to be your nonprofit donors, so you may not think about their issues when you are trying to decide how your content translates into pledge drives. They're less likely to vote, and we actually see electronic redlining on the internet now in terms of if you can micro-target people. In the old days when you advertised on local TV, everybody saw it. Here, there are sets of people who aren't even targeted online because they have a low probability of voting. And then finally, self-expression, they're less likely to have broadband internet, so you may not even hear them in conversations. So you were asking, are there incentives that would help? I'm hopeful about a couple things. One is there is more of a nonprofit incentive that people are starting to think about. People are caring about the information lives of low-income individuals. If you think about ProPublica in their local reporting network, they're starting to partner with reporters in low-income communities. If you think about Report for America, what Steve Waldman founded, he's trying to subsidize local reporting. If you think about Outlier Media in Detroit, they have a really interesting approach where they use text messages to low-income residents. They buy the cell phone numbers of low-income residents and text them and offer to help them figure out if the place they're about to rent has utility problems and foreclosure problems. So I think the information lives of low-income individuals is starting to be an issue on the agenda of media funders. And that's not a market reaction, but that's a nonprofit reaction, which I think is real. There is a hopeful thing though, which is suppose you could radically lower the cost of discovering stories. And that's where computational journalism comes in. Right now, it may be the case that in a rural community, only 1 or 2 people can be funded by the amount of advertising or subscription that's generated in that area. But if you could multiply what 1 or 2 people can do by, for instance, providing data and story recipes that localize a problem at a relatively low cost, then that holds out hope that those stories could be told. So you asked for some optimism. It's a dismal science, but I'm optimistic for 2 reasons. One is the nonprofits are starting to focus on low-income communities and low-income individuals. And if the costs go down, 1 person can tell more stories or more accountability stories. Oh.
I'm going to leave the computational journalism to some questions I know Scott wants to ask you. But I do want to ask you the degree to which nonprofit, there are 2 models for nonprofit out. There are probably more than that, but there are at least 2. One is the nonprofit foundations underwriting journalistic endeavors. And the other, probably not terribly different sometimes, are journalists getting together, banding together, and creating nonprofit news organizations and going out and trying to get subscriptions and to some degree nonprofit, and because of their nonprofit status, getting foundation money or donations. I would like to focus just for a second on the first, which is foundations. Does that not offer up some concerns about having an outside and perhaps not with the transparency of a real publisher, skewing what actually is being delivered to the consumer? That is not necessarily as indigenous as the community itself might be, at least under an advertising model.
Sure. So there are a couple of things that reminds me of. One is when you're looking at comparisons, you could say, I'm going to compare ideal coverage versus the current coverage, or I'm going to compare historical coverage versus current, or I'm going to compare coverage in one area versus another area. And I would agree with you that having an outsider fund the creation of stories runs the risk of a mismatch between what a community really cares about and what a funder might care about. But the sort of relative to what question is, would biased coverage, and in my mind, all 5 of the incentives I've talked about have some bias. Subscription and advertising are biased by income, nonprofit is biased, partisan, self-expression. So we're always in a world of biased coverage. It's in my mind, it would be, given those limitations, what would be the net impact of a funder coming in and providing coverage that might diverge from that which would emerge if local people were fully deciding what to cover. I should note, though, that people are aware of this, and one of the things they're doing is, like, outlier media is, rather than writing about poor people in Detroit as an object, they're trying to provide poor people in Detroit with information almost like a consumer reports. So they don't become the object of reporting, they become the consumers themselves of the information. So they're not trying to write about poor people for an elite audience. They're trying to write directly for the people involved. And you can see similar things with efforts to try to alert people to advantages of the EITC, right? The Earned Income Tax Credit, or letting people know about the provision of particular social services. So I think if you went back 20 years or 15 years, maybe there was a tendency to write about low-income communities as an object. And now there's much more in some areas to try to empower them with information. And also there are even tools like Ground Source or Hearken. Both of those try to reach out to communities and basically say, what's the toughest bill for you to pay? Or what would you like to know more about? And Ground Source does it by putting signs on telephone poles and having people text things. So it's, there is a focus. There's a great group called Sevilla, which is a nonprofit design firm in the Midwest. And what they've done is redesigned the form for benefits from 40 pages to 5 or 6 pages. So using ideas of empathy, user design, and even, in my mind, behavioral economics that tries to say, you know, there's research that says being poor is like pulling an all-nighter every day. You have this cognitive load that is always there for you. And you need to take that into account when you are designing forms for social welfare participation and things like that. So I'm hopeful that when people try to generate stories for and about low-income communities, that they will think about the individuals as individuals rather than as objects.
That's an interesting answer, and you've also pointed us in the direction of some interesting models, and I find I'm most appreciative. I'm not going to pretend to be an economist by any stretch, but I did look at your models and looked at your criteria, and I found them on one hand extremely interesting, but on the other hand, I had trouble laying them onto the world that I think so many media entities, and specifically newspapers, live in. You talk about traditional, just to pick up on something you've written about, traditional definitions of what is newsworthy rely on a formula of who, what, where, when, and why. But that you believe that news goods are offered in the market are actually shaped by 5 other W's. And by the way, I have no quibble with your W's. I'll read them quickly so that our listeners will know what we're talking about. Who cares about a particular piece of information? What are they willing to pay for it? And what are others willing to pay to reach them? Where can media outlets or advertisers reach these people? When is it profitable to provide the information? And why is it profitable? In today's media environment, you have at least 1 or 2, maybe 3 enormous providers of information that is either free or for the price of your data, but are in effect free and with enormous consumer reach. That provide with the ability to target their specific audience and in many degrees are able to tell you if the consumer bid, something that no media operation was ever able to do before. And they have exceptionally low production costs. They pay for their algorithms, but they don't pay for most of the content that they serve up. I have trouble mapping your model onto this reality, and how a newspaper in a local community deals with that media landscape, that reality. You've probably undoubtedly thought about this. Maybe you can lead this media lawyer to the answer that will leave me more hopeful at the end of this hour.
Okay, so first on the 5 economic W's, I'm not saying that a reporter says it's a great day to maximize profits. I can't wait to get into the field. But the set of stories and the set of reporters and eventually the set of outlets, that survive are governed by those economic forces. And the 5 W's are essentially saying on the demographic side, on the demand side, you're more likely to be happy the more people there are like you and the more people we value you in terms of advertising or subscription. There's also a cost to creating information, and the property rights to information also are important here. So when you were talking about, I think Facebook and Google and Twitter in part, they're not necessarily producing, they're not trying to answer the question, what's news or what's truth? They're trying to answer the question, how can I engage you to sell you to advertisers? That's what drives them. And unfortunately, one of the things that the internet has done is stripped away the advertising that once supported the local newspaper that you were talking about. So if you wanted to go directly to what I think local newspapers can do, or what's hopeful about that, I think there's an empirical question, and the way I think about it is the radius of a story. How many people within a given radius of a story are either of enough value to advertisers or have a willingness to pay to support the creation of that story? And on the internet, price gets computed down to marginal cost, and the marginal cost of one more page view on the internet is 0. So what that means is if you were providing facts, commodity facts that other people have, you can't charge for it. So the thing that creates the ability to charge for information is product differentiation. So local outlets have to be able to invest enough in unique stories told in an engaging way to justify a subscription. So when I'm in a hopeful mood about local newspapers, it's for 2 reasons. One is, can you radically lower the cost of discovering stories? That's when I talk about that, and a good example would be the big local news project at Stanford, which grew out of the Stanford Open Policing Project, which basically got 180 million police stop records from around the country and was able to clean the data and create a story recipe so that, and then train hundreds of reporters on how to use the data. So that's generated many local news stories because once you understood the fixed cost of how to spot suspicious police activity and pulling people over, that allowed other people to write that story at a lower cost. So that's a cost side point of hope for small local newspapers. On the demand side, it really is going to depend on how many people it takes to write the story so that you could then support maybe 2 to 3 people. If you look at experiments like the Compass Project, so that's Google and McClatchy, they're doing, the first thing that they were doing was in Ohio when the Vindicator closed. They have a 5-person operation and maybe 3 people would be reporters out of that. So the stories you could tell with 3 people, it's not going to be the same bundle of stories that you were able to tell when there were 30 people on the news staff. But some of those people used to review movies, and Metacritic and IMDb can do that now. Some of them might have been writing takes on national events. You can get that through the New York Times or Washington Post or ProPublica. So to me, the most exciting question about local news is, can you get enough revenue to support 3 to 4 people to cover an area of 100,000 people? And what types of stories could they tell? And are there enough people in that 100,000 person radius that could pay to support 3 people? And to me, that's pretty exciting, and that's what gives me hope, because I don't think we know, and I don't think people are running that experiment yet.
Actually, I ran across a publisher in Simca, Alaska, who was hyper local. This was a number of years ago. I've been meaning to check back with him. You might take a look at his business model. It may be what you're aiming at, and he may be one of the few newspaper publishers who managed to grow, at least when I met him, in the face of a Google and a Facebook. It inspires me to look back on him. All right, I have lots of other questions, but for the moment, I'll try not to be greedy, and I'll turn it to Scott.
Okay, thank you.
Hi, Jay. Thanks so much. I want to go back to something that RonNell asked you earlier. So RonNell gave you a magic wand, and your big ask was fund computational journalism, not like massive public funding of media companies, not like break up the ad networks of Google and Facebook, not regulate surveillance capitalism, not bring back the fairness doctrines, I mean, I'm not sure if it's that you're so hopeful that you think you just need to do things on the edges, or you're so pessimistic that you think that like these wishes are so pie in the sky, you're not even going to use your magic wand on it.
Yeah. If you look at me, I don't look like a magic wand guy. So
no, that's why we like you.
So I thought pretty hard about that. I think that the advertising dollars migrated away from newspapers, not because of antitrust actions, but because Google and Facebook and others were better at what they were doing in terms of analyzing data and targeting ads. There may be anti-competitive acts involved there, but I don't think you necessarily need an antitrust argument about why advertising dollars left newspapers. In terms of the government, I'm influenced a lot by an article by Andre Schleifer, where he looks across the world, across many different countries, and finds that the more government is involved in the media, the worse social outcomes are. That's a correlation argument. It's not a natural experiment, obviously. And we, in our minds, I think sometimes tend to reason from the good public media like NPR, BBC, or NHK. But there are also, we're running our own examples with Voice of America these days, or other areas where we might not be comforted by more dollars flowing into public media. So you're right that I didn't say break up the platforms, and I didn't say infuse more public media. What I like about recognizing the market failures and what that might imply with the government, it's not just funding R&D for computational journalism. It would also be trying to make B corporations or more likely, because that involves recognition of the positive externalities. It also would make it even more likely that people would, another reason to comply with FOIA, if you thought I've studied FOIA. I actually did 35 FOIA requests for my book, and only a third were fulfilled. So, in the major leagues, that would make me great. But, 1 out of 3 that's sort of the reality. And, but the assignment in my class this week for the students is to find investigations that were made possible by FOIA, by documents, and we see those every day. So it's not just one thing, the funding of R&D, it's really embracing the idea that just like education generates public goods and environmental protection generates public goods, the media generate public goods. And then what would the government do? The things that I'm talking about are content neutral and platform agnostic. So I'm not saying that we need more stories about topic X or topic Y. And I'm not saying that we want to help online versus print versus broadcast. If I really had to use the wand, I'd like to use it on 4 people who are in Silicon Valley. So you probably know that Alphabet and Facebook are dual stock structure companies. So they're publicly traded, but the owners and founders have the voting control. And when I look at Facebook and Google, when you read their annual reports, they acknowledge that Mark Zuckerberg can do things that aren't profit maximizing. And it's funny, in the 1980s, sports franchises and media outlets were the 2 industries that were more likely to be owned by families or individuals, in part because they provided psychic income and they gave you influence in your community. Google and Facebook, to me, are media companies. They don't acknowledge it because historically media companies have social responsibility and they don't want to acknowledge that. Prior to 2016, when I looked at Facebook, I thought they were leaving positive externalities on the table, but they were earning a lot of money and then putting it into biomedical research. Historically, media companies put it into media philanthropy, but after 2016, I thought they aren't leaving positive externalities on the table, they're generating negative externalities. So if I had to use my magic wand with regard to the platforms, I would probably use it on those 4 people and have them also recognize the market failures, but have them do it because they're human beings, not because they're forced to by the government.
I like that because that's kind of it's very much counter to what many other people on the show have talked about. So, I mean, that's obviously not an argument of any sort. Actually, it's nice to hear a different view. I guess I'm not even sure I can this is an answerable question, but your response has prompted me to wonder whether you think that the market failure is small or large. That is, when it comes to providing these public interest stories that have positive externalities. Is it that, 20 years ago, yes, there were all these newspapers all over the United States and there weren't these news deserts, but really these people weren't reading the hard-hitting news. They were sports and classifieds and all this other stuff. And so the fact that these newspapers are no longer there is not it's not indicative of people being completely starved for information, or is it that actually there's a huge gap between what the market is serving and what would be optimal, but you think that the cure is worse than the disease?
I think one formulation of a cure could be worse than the disease. But I don't think that all cures are worse than the disease. I mean,
No. Of course, I didn't mean that. I meant the big ticket suggestions that are very popular. Break up Google and Facebook. Let's make let's follow the BBC. surveillance capitalism is draining money away from these small mom and pop things towards these voracious monopolists in Silicon Valley. But so I think what I'm hearing from you is that maybe things are not as bad as we think, but also we ought not make things worse, but engage in targeted interventions that are somewhat small bore.
So I think that the rational ignorance, the underprovision of public affairs reporting has always been there. It's always been a challenge. And in the 1970s and 1980s, the tools that the FCC were given by legislation are pretty blunt and might not necessarily be linked to those market failures. If you fast forward to today, I think that the underprovision of information is extremely serious, particularly in low-income communities, but also think about all we don't know about local institutions. But if you also then say, okay, what's in my economist toolbox? Antitrust? That doesn't necessarily mean that antitrust is the solution to public goods and positive externalities. So I haven't written about it because I still have a very open mind about it. And that's why, that's why I haven't written about it, because I'm still thinking. But I'll give you one example about that. Suppose you went to a newspaper and read 2 reviews about pizza stores, okay? I view that as protected speech. It's the newspaper essentially saying, here's what I think is good pizza. If I type in pizza in Google now, it's going to give me a bunch of responses that are localized, some of which are advertising, some of which there may be some relationship that isn't quite transparent to me about why they're talking about this pizza store. And then some of it may be the organic results generated by the algorithm. I still think of that as whoever did the program, that's his speech. So in the old days, I would say, what's the newspaper, the McClatchy newspaper telling me is the best pizza? Now Google is doing it. One person did it, with an IBM Selectric. The other person did it with algorithms. But to me, they're both media companies answering a question. I know that very question about how Google returns consumer product searches is been subject to regulation and disputes in the EU, and it's also been investigated here. But I tend to think of it still through that media lens. So it's funny. I came to Stanford to direct a journalism program because I do believe that this computational journalism, telling stories by, through, and about algorithms, does hold great promise. So,
so as my last question, I was wondering if you could just talk a bit about computational journalism, because that sounds super interesting, and obviously it's something you're an expert in. So I was wondering if you could just tell us about that.
Sure, thanks. So computational journalism, the way I think about it is stories by, through, and about algorithms. So stories by algorithms, we now, if you look at the Associated Press, they write about 3,500 stories by algorithm whenever quarterly earnings reports are released, because there's a framework and a cookie cutter. And then if it exceeds expectations, then they put a human on it and they build it out with quotations or things like that. So right now you can get pretty good finance and sports stories by algorithms. Stories through algorithms, that's the Atlanta Journal-Constitution's Pulitzer finalist that used machine learning to write about sexual abuse by doctors who are still practicing. They scraped the web of all 50 state medical societies, and they got 100,000 cases, disciplinary cases, and they used a machine learning model to say what cases are using language that probably denotes sexual harassment or abuse, and they whittled that down to 6,000 cases, and then they read all of those 6,000 cases. So the algorithm made the writing possible. It was great accountability journalism. And then stories about algorithms. It's really great if you look at ProPublica's machine bias stories, where they went to Facebook and they said, we'd like to place an ad for housing related services, but don't show it to African Americans. Now, of course, they didn't say that human to human. They just placed a housing related services ad and used a drop down menu to exclude people in the affinity group, African Americans. And that story helped generate lawsuits, and it helped generate a settlement, so that now credit, housing, and job ads in Facebook are supposed to go through a portal that doesn't allow you to do drop-down menus that target certain groups of people. And the people who wrote that now run The Markup, which is a great nonprofit site about tech. So can you write the story by algorithm? Can you discover the story through algorithm? And can you actually do accountability reporting about the algorithms? That's sort of a quick summary of the field.
Oh, thank you so much. I think we've run out of time. I'm going to throw this right back to RonNell. Thank you so much, Jay.
Jay, there are dozens, hundreds of other questions that we would like to ask and ways that we'd like to burrow down, but we're super grateful to have gotten the chance to talk to you, to hear a little bit about your research, to hear a little bit about your hopes and plans for the future, and to hear some concrete ideas about the ways that we could put some of these mechanisms to use as we think about the solutions that intersect in some of these ways. Thank you so much for joining us.
Yeah, really, thank you.
I want to say I really loved your questions. I realized that I'm an outlier, and I think we'll know in a couple of years if I was able to make any progress on the questions you raised. So thank you very much.
Oh, thank you. It's so fantastic to talk to you.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.
Take care.